For our next conversation, we have the great and and well-regarded Eileen from currently at Union, but hail from Nashville. So you're bringing unity out of the North and the South in some of your work as well. And so, as similar to all of the other speakers we've had with us, can you tell us a little bit about the article that you wrote for the companion and what your process was for writing that?
Sure. I got a terrible subject, actually, because I got writing qualitative research and theology, and it cuts across every other topic in the whole book. And I mean, it felt impossible to write in many ways. And I told Pete when I finally turned my section in, my chapter in, that I threw away probably 3 times as many words as I turned in. And even the one I turned in, I wasn't happy with, and it's gotten major revisions. So it's very difficult to capture a practice like writing that we all take for granted and that we all have to engage in if we're going to do this work. As doctoral students, as scholars, as many of us are also have other commitments beyond the academy, right? For myself, as an ordained minister, I have commitments to ministry. I learned to write for an audience by being a pastor who wrote sermons and being a curriculum writer who wrote for Sunday school and other kinds of materials for people to teach from. So my beginnings of learning to write were not in the academy, and the academy disciplined me into new kinds of ways of writing, and then I had to undiscipline myself out of them as I continued to do my work. Nods around the room. And I like the notion that they're not talking about writing, but when Stuart and Hubert Dreyfus are writing about practice and learning the skills of a practice, I think that it's helpful to put reading into the category of a crude practice or crude skill, because it's actually very easy for humans to learn to read. 86% of the world is literate, and that wasn't true 50 years ago, but it has become true, and that tells you how quickly humans can learn to read. Our brains are actually geared to it. But learning to write is a more complex and subtle skill, they would say. I'm taking their term. And that kind of subtle skill of learning to write is not just the physical, ability to use one's hand or fingers and put the technical skills of writing into practice, but then taking the complex ideas of the world and putting them into a kind of writing that then has many communities of accountability. There's the accountability that we have to our academic disciplines, colleagues. When we want to write for publication, we have to meet the firewalls of all kinds of disciplinary guidelines and the iron cages that we're writing into and out of, to borrow the term that we were talking about, that Lick was talking about earlier. And so writing is a very multifaceted, very complex, and very challenging skill to learn. So when I started trying to unpack that in a way through the chapter, it was its own challenge. And so what I did was a couple of different things that will stay in the chapter throughout some other stuff. But I'm interested in trying to understand, because this book is largely for all of us, but especially for doctoral students. What's it like to be a beginning writer in qualitative research and theology? I'm getting at that in a couple of different ways, including using the framework that the Dreyfus-Spinner model offers us, which is the novice to expert continuum of learning. And when we're novices in writing theology or qualitative research, we're really already novices in 2 things, and then a third is in writing it. So we're a novice upon a novice. It feels like you're always just starting again. And when I start a new project, I often find myself thinking, well, I don't really know how to do this, and I'm having to start yet again. So if you're feeling as a new beginning writer, you don't know what you're doing, you're right. and most of us didn't know what we were doing. So I also rehearse in the chapter some of the mistakes, novice and beginner mistakes that I made, as a way to give some of you a kind of foothold up as you're writing to maybe not make some of those same mistakes. I talk about 3 different places in the process where you need to write. You need to write at the beginning of projects. You need to dream about them. You need to imagine what the project is about, frame it with questions, frame it with theological commitments, think about the ways other communities have already written or studied or tried to bring that project, that area of life into a written form that we can understand or learn from. So that beginning stage, we have to do some writing. It also includes things like grant writing and proposal writing and all those moments where we have to like try to tell the future, which we can't really do. So there's beginning moments, and then there's the moments in the field. We have moments in the field where we have to do ethnographic field notes, where we need to write down what people are telling us. We need to write what we're thinking. We need to write about what some people would call memos, where we learn, we're sort of making a trail of how we're learning as we go through a project and do the qualitative research. That's also probably, as we're doing it, changing our theological thinking. So we're actually writing theology at that point. You don't do qualitative research and then at the end, think theologically about it. I mean, certainly some people do that, but that is not a good approach. You're doing theology all along the way. It's better to be explicit about that, I think. And Chris Sharon and I have written an article that sort of makes that argument at length, called Ethnography on Holy Ground. And we're recounting our process of interviewing ministers in a longitudinal study. So there's that middle place where you're writing in the midst of the research. And then there comes that point where we think the writing really happens, right? Which is to write it up for some kind of publication or to write it up. Boy, though, we have so many audiences. At lunch, we were talking more at length about we write for the people that we've been studying with and learning from. And if we skip over the step of writing to them and for them and with them, I think that the quality of our project is severely diminished. And so we have this, I think, an ethical obligation to write what we write in a way that they can see it and tell us where we got it wrong and what we could have done better to understand that. And often we have to be very sensitive at that point about our social location and the dynamics of power. Because when you hand people, you're the researcher, and you hand people what you've written, they go like this: oh, that's wonderful, thank you for writing that. And you really have to ask a lot of questions and make enough space for them to come back and say, actually, that part you wrote about XYZ, that didn't really get me. It's hard for them to do that because of the dynamics of power. And so I think it's essential that we ask our informants to give us their thoughts about what we've written. Now, that doesn't have to be their thoughts on everything we've written, but certainly what we've written about them. Okay, that's a first level of audience. And I did write about reflexivity in this way, and I make an argument that reflexivity is always relational. We don't just write about our own social location and try to prove that we're located in a certain place, and that means in terms of the power dynamics that someone else is then located to us in a particular way. No, where the rubber hits the road is when you send that first draft back to your informants and they say, I didn't think you were going to include that in your book. And you say, that's half a chapter. That happened to me. And you have to then negotiate and not overly pressure a person to get them to understand the value of their story to be included in the piece that you're writing, for instance. And so I recount that in that same article about reflexivity, and I'm really trying to point out that it's all communal and relational. And I believe theology to be a highly relational, communal set of practices and thinking and lived experience. So there's another point at which we're writing. And then we have to write for our disciplines. If we're going to be academic theologians or academic people in the world, we have a whole lot of firewalls to get past every time we want to publish something. So there's another place. And then just the artfulness of writing itself. It's not easy to bring a project together, and it takes practice at doing that, more than one draft of things. I know there are people who manage to publish their first drafts occasionally, and I'm proud for them, but I'm not that person. I write many drafts of everything. I want to tell you just a couple of things that I think of as missteps. I want to have this in front of me while I do this. One of the writing mistakes, it's also a research mistake, is to mistake the questions of the research project. What am I trying to learn, for an interview question? They're not the same thing. And you need to ask an interview question that gets to what you need and not just restates your project, because people can't actually think well with you in that way. A good example from the Learning Pastoral Imagination Project, if we went to the ministers in our study and just said, tell us, how's that pastoral imagination going in your life? They'd be like, and they'd have to think hard, and then they would try to please us with what they said, because we'd ask them such a limited question. Instead, we asked a very big, open-ended question. We say, tell us about a recent aha moment in your life and ministry. And then they tell us stories where we see how pastoral imagination infuses what they're doing. So there's many ways that we have to think about our writing of questions. I didn't write field notes soon enough. We need to write, I need to write them sooner. I learned that earlier, I had to learn that hard way. I didn't talk to enough people while learning to write. There's 3 stages. I coach writers. And so one of the things I tell them, there's 3 real important points we're going to talk to people and not just get stuck and write. One is the beginning of a project. Trying to imagine it, trying to figure it out. It's a good time to talk to people, not just sit at your cubicle and write. Get out there and have some conversation about that. Second place is anytime you get stuck. Can't get any writing done. It's time to talk to somebody and get it out of your head and into a conversation. And like we set our topics more quickly in this conversation, then we can write them in 5,000 words. You know, talking is really helpful. And then when you're at the end and you're feeling like you're done, but you're not quite sure if you're done, it's another good time to talk to somebody. But I had to learn those things. I did not enough talking early on to get my projects off the ground. I wanted to name a few common mistakes of writing that happen in a lot of places and as we're doing this work. Don't decide you have to know what you're going to say before you write. Instead, write to think. And that's a crucial one for most people. We need to actually get it on paper to see what we think. And then we can revise it and hone it and make it better. That's a common novice mistake. Another is thinking it's something we do by ourselves. It is in a community. And then there's these disciplinary mistakes that you're going to make, and they're correctable. These are all correctable. Mistakes of logic, arguing against yourself in your own work, misunderstanding your data, like in a way that other people can help you not do that, including the informants, missing salient features of what's going on in the situation, failing to locate yourself in your own project. Easy novice mistake to make. And then missing that feedback loop from the people that you're writing about. And then I want to talk about integration for just a minute. I was trained in a program where I was doing pastoral theology. So I was already in a multidisciplinary program. I was learning theology, psychology of all many kinds, and under a kind of umbrella of practical theology, thinking about how those related to each other. It's not always integration, but that was a part of what I was interested in. And I was doing work, this was sort of in a way, some of my first field work, although I haven't published about it. I'm going to say a little bit about, I do say a little bit about it in this article. I was going to Renewal House, which is a place for women in recovery from addictions. And I was literally going every week, sometimes twice a week, from Vanderbilt, stronghold of academic theology, 14 miles away to a different brick building with women and their children trying to work on recovery issues, having lived through traumas of various kinds, trying to reestablish a livable life. And I'm working with the staff, and I'm working with individual women and children, and I'm reading all this academic theology and all this pastoral theology and qualitative research methods. And it's a lot to hold in one mind, right? And yet I was just doing it every day. I learned so much, though, from the embodied experience of being with them, being in the space, feeling what it was like to live in anxiety and fear about would you be able to make it when you had to leave that place. Very different than the security of a what I call the Vanderbubble. I don't call it that, everybody calls it the Vanderbubble. And moving back and forth in that space, I finally came to see that it wasn't just that psychology was going to help me interpret what was happening in their lives. It wasn't just theology that was going to help me. It wasn't the qualitative research methods I was using that was going to help me interpret what was happening. It was what I think of as a third thing. And I want to read just a tiny bit because I'll say it quicker if I actually do read this part than if I try to say it. So my emerging capacity for perceiving the world was not simply the result of two or more different worldviews conversing with each other, nor was it the famed and maligned cultural questions answered by theological responses. That's Tillich in the 1950s. Nor was it even the revised critical correlation of Browning, Tracy, etc. These models attempt integration primarily in and with the worlds of words and argument and logic, often suffering from abstraction and reduction. Pastoral theologians came closer to capturing what my lived experience and my clinical engagements were like in this work, yet even their writing could not mirror the thickness and multiplicity of what I was witnessing each week. My experience led to a multidimensional, messy, and sacred way of perceiving the world, which continues to shape my writing and my research and my practical theological understandings. I needed every theological and psychological resource, my years of pastoral experience, my training in qualitative research and anthropology, and my practices of prayer and spiritual formation to equip me for becoming a part of the healing community. That's what I was doing. I was trying to be part of a healing community. At Renewal House, that's Richard Allman's got a wonderful book on that, 1974. And eventually, at a faculty workshop led by Richard Karp, I found the metaphor that helped me capture the gifts and complexities and challenges of this new perspective that was emerging in me. Here's a quote from my book from 5 years ago. To see in depth, this is the metaphor, is a matter of perspective taking. Rather than take a singular and potentially reductive perspective from psychology or theological anthropology, the set of arguments in the book that I wrote 5 years ago are crafted from two kinds of vision, each two-dimensional alone, but brought together into a third dimension, one of depth. In human sight, among the other predators, two eyes, two angles of vision actually create depth perception. And they produce a third dimension of greater complexity and more possibilities for seeing. So the things I was bringing into my seeing stopped being separate things. And I actually think about the way I see the world now as a third indefinable. It's not limited or defined by either of my disciplinary trainings or the qualitative research, which would be a third. It's really a way of seeing that holds all that together and sees the thing for what it is itself, and that these others are interpretations for that three-dimensional thing that we would call life. And so that has become deeply important to me in trying to articulate, but it's incredibly hard to, again, reduce it down to words. So that's my integration. That's what happened for me. That's the metaphor that emerged for me. I don't know that it's what you need in your learning, you who are on the screen with us. I don't know what thing will emerge for you as the way to see the world and be in it, bear witness to it, and then bring it to life in words on pages or screens. But But staying with it long enough, treating it as a practice that I was learning over time, allowed that to emerge for me. And by my telling you my case study of how I learned integration and writing and related things, you have a contrast. I'm giving you a contrast, which allows you to raise your own consciousness about what you understand and the way your process works. Because while I'm talking, you're thinking, well, I didn't do it that way and I'm not like that. You're telling yourself about how you operate. And this leads me to a little bit of a response I want to make to the earlier question we got about generalizability. And then our brother Luke Brotherton brought it up as well. There's a kind of ongoing love of the sciences in our culture that thinks the more you have of something, the better it is, the more numbers you have, the more cases you have. Cases are good. I'm not disparaging numbers. They're important. But having a lot of numbers, like all the people this age do that, and all the people this age do that, and that's actually lower level understanding for human beings. Case studies are actually much higher level understanding for human beings because we have to understand complexity that we can't get in those numbers. They're too reductive. So Patricia Benner uses the image of the universal particular. And she talks about, if you want to understand starfish, you don't just count up how many starfish are in the ocean. Well, you don't know anything more about starfish than just how many of them there are. But if you follow one starfish all day or for a week or its whole life cycle, you know a lot about starfish. So in theology and practical theology, qualitative research, we bring those together. We're doing the kind of research that's like following a starfish for its whole life cycle. And it's a very complex and high level of understanding to take. So it is universal. That starfish had a unique life, but it also tells us a lot about all kinds of other starfish. So generalizability has a different meaning when you try to accept the differences of what we're doing in our work is about understanding life and the excess that Luke was pointing us to, the excess of human being, the transcendence of human being. We really need to look carefully at small numbers of that to understand what's there. And then when we present it with our writing to each other and enter into conversations with each other, then our understanding has gone up everywhere. And so I'll say more about this and some other things I've written. If you want to talk more about it, we can. But I wanted to at least come back to that. So it was an earlier question. And I was appreciating things. Bent Fleeberg is a very helpful social scientist to be in conversation with about understanding how human learning actually is based in case-based learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To really understand what's going on, we need to understand a situation in its fullness. And the more we layer in case upon case upon case, our knowledge and eventually our wisdom expands in ways beyond what all the sort of reductive understandings of human life and experience can't get at. I'll stop there. I could say more. I have more in my notes, but I'm going to pause there.
Eileen, can you just say the book that you read from?
That was a chapter that's coming out.
When you said you were reading.
Oh,
from
Anatomy
5
of
years,
Schism.
yes.
Yeah. So Anatomy of a Schism. So I did bring it up here with me. Oh, it's got a shiny thing on it. Yeah, it's the full title is Anatomy of a Schism. How clergy women's narratives reinterpret the fracturing of the Southern Baptist Convention. And that actually might be one helpful thing to say to as also a kind of novice mistake. I thought I was doing a project about how clergy women were resilient, how they coped, how they stayed at their work when everything around them was saying, you don't belong here. Why are you a minister? God couldn't have called you. I wanted to understand how do these women thrive or apparently at least continue on in their work when they're getting so much hostile pushback. But what I learned as I was in the process of interviewing and getting them to know them was that their stories had a power of reinterpreting the meaning of the entire split of Southern Baptists. And they had never been taken seriously as the center point for that conversation, that discussion, or those arguments. And what I learned from them digging deeply into each of their stories, is that what was at stake was not just an argument about the Bible or who had political power in the SBC, or whether inerrancy is real or not, or whether women should be ordained or not. What was at stake in that whole split was what it means to be human. And their lives were an attempt to say, I am fully human. God made me this way and called me to do these things. And if the whole world says they're against me, it's still what I'm called to do. And so I talk about it psychologically, theologically, and in terms of practice of ministry. But I had to shift my own thinking from thinking I was doing the project about one thing and then seeing through that it was actually about something much bigger. But it took months for that to emerge and conversations with important mentors for that to actually come forward.
Well, thank you so much, Eileen. I feel very sort of fired up to write. And so clearly you are an educator, a coach, a pastor. All of these sensibilities came out in what you were sharing. So thankful for your overview of that chapter, and so looking forward to digging into it. I want to tie some themes together before you move on and hear a little bit from Glenn. This idea of bearing witness and your sort of beautifully written metaphor about how we see and how we see in different dimensions. I mean, we as Christians, we think we're bearing witness to something, but if we're only trained in one disciplinary way of thinking, in one way of being, to only write a certain way, then you're not actually seeing everything, and you're not actually bearing the kind of witness you want to. And I just love the way that you talked about writing as a process, but blurring all the lines, not just between generalizing and prescribing or whatnot, but that, when you take all that reading and writing and you go into the community, that's when what you've read and wrote became real. And that you can't really write it until you go in. And then you can't really, write alone. And so all these things sort of blend together, and I think in a very beautiful way. So thank you for bringing that perspective.